All right, so today we are going to be solving a challenge which introduces a nice concept in C known as variadic functions. Okay, so let's read the prompt. Variadic functions are functions which take a variable number of arguments. In C programming, a variadic function will contribute to the flexibility of the program that you are developing. The declaration of a variadic function starts with the declaration of at least one named variable and uses an ellipsis as the last parameter, right? So an example is printf. Printf is actually a variadic function because it's possible to pass more than one input or not define the number of, it doesn't have a specific number of inputs, right? 5 inputs, and then if you don't put 5 inputs, it doesn't work. Or if you put more than 5 inputs, it doesn't work. It can take a variable number of inputs, and that's how printf works. And that's what variadic functions are. They are basically functions that can take a varied number of inputs. It's as simple as that. And in this problem, you implement three variadic functions named sum, min, and max to calculate sums, minima, and maxima of a variable number of arguments. The first argument passed to the variadic function is the count of the number of arguments, which is followed by the arguments themselves. Idea, the whole idea is we'll be given we have to implement the functions, sum, min, and max, and then our functions will be tested to see if they work. That's all. Now, in defining variadic functions, there are three things we have to know. We first have to know the fact that in order to use variadic functions, in order to declare or define variadic functions, there is a certain header file that is very important because it contains certain functions that we need to implement variadic functions. And this header file is the stdarg.h header file. This header file contains certain functions that will be required in our implementation. Now, in order to implement a variadic function, the first thing we have to do is we have to initialize. Okay, we have to initialize the arguments, or let me say the argument list, because the three dots here, right, is representing a certain number of arguments which we don't know. So we first have to sort of get those arguments, and in getting those arguments, we first have to initialize them in a certain list. And before we have even initialize them, we have to create that list. So in creating the list, this is a special list known as the variadic argument list. And this is how we create it with this data type. And then we're going to call it args for arguments. Okay. Then we initialize it using va stats. Then we pass in the name of the list that we are initializing and the number of variables that will be passed. Okay, which in this case is count, because as we were told, the count will represent the number of values they will pass to us. So if count is 5, it means we'll receive 5 numbers. Then those 5 numbers, we'll have to sum them. That's the idea. If we are implementing it in the min, then it means those 5 numbers, we'll have to find the minimum value, and so on. For the max too, we'll have to find the maximum value. So this is the first two things we'll do. After that, we can now implement the sum. Okay, so now to implement the sum, we have to first create a sum variable, set it equal to 0. Okay, then you know how we implement summation of numbers. You just have to create a for loop. Okay, int I equals 0, I less than count. Run the for loop for the number of numbers we have. That's why I is less than count, and then we increment I plus plus. So sum will be equal to sum plus the argument that we are dealing with at this point. And this is how we get that argument. VA we pass in the args list and we pass in the data type. Okay, so now this VA function, sort of at the start of the program, it points to after we've done the initialization and everything, the VA points to the first argument. Then when we call VA the second time, it will move to the next argument. So we get to the last argument. So that's how VA works. And it takes the args list, which is the argument list we created here, right? And then the data type of the data that we are reading. And then we do that and then we find our sum. Now, after we are done, we have to end the whole variadic something. So we use VA end, we pass in the list, and that ends it, okay? Sort of closes the pipeline. It's like a file. So you know that in C, anytime you read a file, you have to close the file to ensure you don't have memory leakage. So we do the same thing here by ending that, and then we return the sum. That's it. And we are going to do this for the min and for the max. Now, two things that will repeat. This will repeat. So we can just copy this and paste it in min. Okay. Then now we can implement minima function. Now, in finding the min, the first thing we do is that we have to create a min variable and set it equal to one of the arguments within the argument list, the variadic argument list. Okay, so that will be VA okay, args int. So min will be equal to sort of the first one. Then in our implementation, in our for loop, we'll have int I equals 0, I less than count, I plus plus. Okay, and then now we'll first find the current argument. Why am I doing this? Because if I don't create a variable to store the current argument and I directly compare min to VA since VA keeps changing, it will not go through, it will end up not going through all the variables. In order to avoid that, we first create a variable to store the current argument. So that's what I'll do here. Because every time you call VA it moves to another number. So right now that I've called VA here, right? If I call VA the next time, it will not point to the first number, it will point to the next number. So if I use VA directly in here without storing it within the variable that we're about to create, what happens is that I'll end up not comparing VA to the main values. I'll end up not comparing all the arguments within the list to the main, which will make my main implementation wrong. My minimum function implementation will be wrong. So because of that, we are going to first create something called, which will store the current argument, right? And then that's what we'll be comparing. So current argument will be equal to VA we pass in the args and we pass in the data type. Okay, then we now compare if the min is greater than the current arg, right? Then we set the min to be current arg. Now you understand what I was talking about. If I didn't create current arg, it means I would have said if min is greater than VA args int, then set min to be equal to VA args int. But remember, we would have called VA args int twice, meaning that the number we'll have here will be different from the number we'll have here, and that will end up giving us a wrong implementation. So that's what I was trying to explain. Okay, so now after we've done this, if the min is greater than this, set it to be equal to this, and then run the loop. Okay, so once we are done, as I said, we have to end the process. So we end it, and then we return the min. Let's make this fast so that the video is no longer than necessary. So for the max, we just copy this and then change everything to max. So this will be the same. This will now be max. Okay, and this will be max, and this will be less than. Okay, and this will also be max, and we'll return max. Okay, so this is the implementation. Very simple, very straightforward. We are going to test it now. Fingers crossed, and it passed. Okay, We can submit it and passes all the test cases. Amazing. All right. So that's it for today's video. Thank you for